On a chilly Nairobi morning in March 1975, a man who once herded goats barefoot on stony hillsides is buttoning up a neatly pressed suit, knowing that if his enemies get their way, he has less than 48 hours to live. Cars hiss past on wet tarmac, newspapers shout headlines about rising prices and land disputes, and Josiah Mwangi Kariuki, JM, to friends and enemies alike, is staring at his own name in black ink, printed next to the word traitor. Somewhere in another office, a rival is sharpening a speech, a blade made of words and whispers, ready to cut him down in Parliament. And in the court of public opinion, the clock is ticking, the country is young, and for JM, time is already running out. To understand how a herd boy became the man the powerful wanted dead, we have to go back to the dust, the hunger, and the first time he realized that in Kenya, even as a child, you could be poor in a land that was overflowing. He was born in 1929, in the windswept landscapes near Gilgil, long before anyone called this place an independent nation. The British flag flew high, but on the ground his family's life was painfully low. His world was red soil, thorn bushes, and the thin, restless goats he drove from one patch of grass to another. The mornings were cold enough to sting his bare feet, the afternoons so hot that the air above the road shimmered like a mirage. Hunger wasn't a rare visitor in the Kariuki homestead. It was a constant, sitting quietly in the corner, waiting for the smallest excuse to step into the center of the room. One image stayed with him forever. A train, roaring past the small settlement like some iron monster, dragging behind it wagons of wheat, maize, and cattle. Through the cracks in the wooden slats, he could glimpse the full sacks and the strong, well-fed oxen. That train was headed to markets, to white-owned farms, to the dinner tables of people who never had to count how many mouths they could afford to feed. The dust from the tracks blew into his eyes and the eyes of the children around him, all of them barefoot, all of them watching a river of wealth flow right by, untouchable. That contrast burned itself into JM's mind. How could there be so much, and yet they had so little? How could the land be this rich and the people on it this poor? Even as a boy, he wasn't content with silence. He asked questions that made adults uncomfortable. "Why can't we use that land over there?" he would ask, pointing beyond a fence to a lush, empty field. "Why does one man own so much when we don't have enough?" Sometimes the answers were whispered. Sometimes they were just a sharp look and a warning to keep his mouth shut if he wanted to stay out of trouble. Trouble in colonial Kenya had a way of finding young men who asked the wrong questions. School was his first small rebellion. His father could barely afford the fees, and many mornings JM had to choose between going to class hungry or staying home to help with the goats. He chose the classroom again and again, his stomach growling louder than the teacher's voice. He walked kilometers to the mission school, his exercise books clutched in hands rough from farm work. Chalk dust and the murmur of lessons in English and Kiswahili became weapons he intended to sharpen. In a world where land and power were already taken, knowledge looked like the one thing he might still seize. It was at school that he met the boy who would become his mirror, and later his rival. Karanja arrived one term later, tall for his age, with quick eyes that missed nothing. If JM was all urgency and intensity, Karanja was smooth, charming, perfectly at ease. He laughed easily with the teachers, picked up English with a confidence that made the other boys both admire and resent him. On the football field, they played on the same team. In class, they raced for the top spot. Every exam result was a silent battle. Sometimes JM won. Sometimes Karanja did. Each victory mattered. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and turned the blackboard into a glaring mirror, their teacher wrote 2 words in large letters: loyalty and freedom. He asked each boy what he would choose, if forced. JM didn't hesitate. "Freedom," he answered, his voice steady. Karanja paused, then smiled. "Loyalty," he said, "because with loyalty to the right people, you can get freedom, and more." The class laughed, but the teacher watched quietly, as if he knew that this small philosophical game was the beginning of something much bigger. 2 boys, 2 instincts, one drawn to justice at any cost, the other to power through alliances. Neither realized that years later, those instincts would collide in a deadly arena. Outside the classroom, the country was changing. Whispers traveled faster than official news. Men spoke in low tones about land that had been taken, about chiefs who collaborated, about a movement growing in the forests. At night, JM would hear his older relatives argue. Was resistance madness or the only path left? Some spoke the word Mau Mau like a curse, others under their breath like a prayer. The first twist in JM's life came not from politics, but from humiliation. He was barely a teenager when his family, in desperate need of income, agreed to send him to work on a white settler's farm. The land stretched as far as the eye could see, endless rows of coffee bushes, fat cows grazing in green fields, a big house with a wide veranda. The settler, a red-faced man with a booming voice, liked to show off. "All this," he once told his guests, gesturing at the hills, "is my little kingdom." JM, standing nearby with a tray in his shaking hands, felt the words stab deeper than any insult. My little kingdom. As if no one else had ever lived here. As if the people who had been on this land for generations were ghosts. One day, after a long shift, JM made a small mistake. A cup slipped. Hot tea spilled dangerously close to the settler's boots. The room went silent. The man's face darkened. In front of the gathered guests, he slapped JM so hard that the boy staggered, the tray crashing to the floor. "You people should be grateful we give you work," he snarled. "Without us, you are nothing." Those words, "you are nothing," would echo in JM's head for years. He walked back to the servants' quarters that night with his cheek burning, humiliated, but inside something had hardened. If this was what loyalty to the colonial order brought, humiliation, violence, the constant reminder that he was considered less than human, then he wanted no part of it. When he next saw Karanja, who had found a more comfortable job as a clerk's assistant in town, their paths already looked different. Karanja spoke eagerly of a future where educated Africans would slowly be allowed more responsibility, where good behavior and patience would be rewarded. "Why make trouble?" he asked, shrugging. "We can rise from inside the system." JM stared at him, remembering the slap, the laughter of the white guests, the way the settler had called the farm his kingdom. "What if the system is built to keep us outside?" JM replied quietly, "What then?" Their friendship didn't break that day, but a crack appeared. A hairline fracture that pressure and time would turn into a canyon. As the 1940s turned into the early 1950s, the rumblings of rebellion grew louder. JM was now a young man, moving between odd jobs, scraping together a living, soaking up every speech, every whispered meeting, every leaflet that came his way. The idea that Kenya could be free, that men like him could own land legally without fear of eviction, was intoxicating. He saw veterans of the Second World War, men who had fought in far-off fields for an empire that refused to acknowledge their humanity, return to find their own homes still under the control of settlers and chiefs. The injustice was so blatant it felt like an open wound. The British government, alarmed by the organizing in the forests and the murmurs in the villages, responded with force. Emergency regulations, raids at dawn, curfews. The word suspect became a net that could catch almost any young Kikuyu man and drag him away. JM began to help the resistance in small but dangerous ways. A message carried, a meeting quietly protected. A few shillings passed to the families of those who had gone to the forest. These were not grand, heroic acts, but in a colony that watched and recorded everything, even a whisper could be treated as a shout. One night, in a cramped room lit only by a smoking paraffin lamp, he found himself face to face with a man whose name was already becoming legend in nationalist circles. Jomo Kenyatta. The future president was calm, measured, his voice carrying the authority of someone who believed, without doubt, that history was on their side. JM listened, spellbound, as Kenyatta spoke of a Kenya where land would be returned, where Africans would decide their own future. For a moment, in that heat and darkness, the dream felt close enough to touch. But dreams have a price. The colonial state struck back with ruthless efficiency. In 1952, the emergency was declared. Leaders were arrested, meetings banned, entire villages uprooted and fenced into protected areas. JM, now firmly marked as a troublemaker, found himself on a list. One dawn, the pounding on the door came. Boots on the floor, shouted orders in English and Kiswahili, rough hands dragging him out as his family shouted and cried. He was thrown into detention, part of a vast network of camps where thousands of Kenyan men were held without trial. The conditions were brutal. Men were worked to exhaustion, punished for the smallest violations, forced to confess to crimes they hadn't committed just to be allowed a slightly less cruel routine. In the sharp smell of sweat, fear, and red earth, JM came face to face with the machinery of empire, stripped of all its polite masks. And then, in one of those twists that history loves, he saw a familiar face across the yard. Karanja. But the boy he had known from school looked different now. He wore a better shirt, his posture was straighter, and the guards treated him with a certain casual respect. Karanja wasn't a detainee, he was an interpreter, a go-between, working with the administration to extract information from prisoners, to convince them to sign statements to identify hardcore suspects. Their eyes met. For a moment, time stopped. Two boys from the same classrooms, the same dusty roads, now standing on opposite sides of a barbed wire fence. "JM," Karanja said quietly, when he managed to approach him during a distribution of rations. "You shouldn't have gotten yourself mixed up in this." His tone carried a mix of concern and something colder. "If you cooperate, they'll release you sooner. You're smart. Don't throw your life away." JM stared at him, incredulous. "Cooperate?" he repeated. "With the people who beat us, who took our land, who locked us up without charges. That's your answer?" "Think long-term," Karanja replied, his eyes flicking nervously to a nearby guard. "These are the people in power now. If we want any future at all, we need to work with them. I'm making connections. When this is over, it's men like me they'll trust." In that moment, the rivalry that had once been about school marks and football scores turned into something else. JM realized that Karanja wasn't just trying to survive. He was already positioning himself, aligning with the very forces that had put them in chains. For Karanja, the clock was counting down to his own rise. For JM, it was counting down to an entirely different decision. How far was he willing to go for the freedom he believed in? Days in the camp blurred into weeks, then months. Hard labor under a sun that felt vengeful. Roll calls in the cold dawn, where any man who stepped out of line could be singled out for punishment. At night, the detainees whispered to each other, news smuggled in about battles in the forest, arrests in the city, political arguments that tried to make sense of the chaos. JM listened, absorbing everything. The camp was a prison, but it was also a brutal university. He learned about power, about fear, and about the ways a system could crush a man's body while trying to break his spirit. He also watched Karanja work. The once friendly schoolmate now walked between guards and prisoners, translating their words, sometimes softening them, sometimes hardening them, always calculating. It wasn't simple betrayal, it was something colder, more strategic. Karanja was gambling that when the emergency ended, and everyone sensed that it could not last forever, those who had cooperated would be allowed to sit at the table. Those who had resisted would be kept outside or silenced. JM made a different gamble. He saved his strength, avoided pointless confrontations, and began to think seriously about what would happen after independence. It was no longer enough, in his mind, to simply throw off the colonial yoke. The real fight, he realized, would be over what came next. Who would own the land? Who would write the laws? Who would eat? And who would continue to watch trains of wealth pass them by? When he was finally released, thinner but unbroken, the world beyond the barbed wire had already started to shift. International pressure was mounting. The cost of maintaining the emergency was rising. Even the British were beginning to talk carefully about constitutional change. The air was thick with uncertainty and opportunity. For men like Karanja, it was the moment they had prepared for. For JM, it was something else, the beginning of a race he hadn't fully known he was entering. He stepped back into a Kenya where nothing and everything was the same. Villages had been reorganized into emergency villages. Some old friends were dead. Others had disappeared into the forests or melted into cities. The settler farms still spread across the hills, but there were rumors, whispered in markets, discussed in churches after the sermons, that some of this land might one day soon be sold or redistributed. JM knew one thing. He could not go back to simply herding goats or serving tea. The camp had changed him. The slap on the settler farm had changed him. The sight of Karanja smiling politely at colonial officers had changed him. If the future was being negotiated, he needed to be in the room. Politics for him wasn't an abstract concept anymore. It was the mechanism that decided who would forever be told, "You are nothing," and who would finally have the chance to say, "This is our land. This is our country." And somewhere in Nairobi, in a government office with polished floors and an eye on the coming era, Karanja was already writing his own name into the list of those who intended to rule that future. 2 young men, 1 country, a shrinking window of time before independence froze certain choices into place forever. When JM walked out of detention, the first thing he saw wasn't freedom. It was a butcher's stall piled high with meat he couldn't afford, glistening in the Nairobi sun like a promise that wasn't meant for him. The city smelled of roasted maize, petrol fumes, and wet dust. Buses rattled past with hand-painted signs, crowded with workers hanging off the doors. Shops blasted music from scratched records. To a stranger, it might have looked like a place buzzing with opportunity. To JM, still carrying the stink of the camp in his clothes, it felt like a theater where a show about freedom was being rehearsed. While the script was still being written by the same hands that had locked him up, he had no money, no official papers that proved his detention was over, and no clear plan. What he did have was a hard-earned understanding. In the new world that was coming, those who moved fastest would shape the rules. The rest would be shaped by them. Time, once measured in roll calls and work details, now ticked in a different way. Independence was no longer a distant dream. People whispered that London and Nairobi were already haggling over dates, borders, and constitutions. Every month, new political groups formed, split, then reformed under different names. The race to lead Kenya after the British left had begun. The starting gun had fired while JM was still behind barbed wire. He couldn't afford to start from zero. So he did something that would have shocked the boy who once burned with pure anger in the settler's kitchen. He went into business. At first it was small things. He found work in a hotel, sweeping floors and washing dishes, observing how money flowed, who tipped well, who paid with a casual flick of their wrist, and who argued over every cent. He watched the managers more closely than the guests, how they spoke to suppliers, how they smoothed over problems with a handshake or a quiet drink after hours. In colonial Kenya, business licenses and contracts depended on politics, on tribal alliances, on being acceptable to those in power. JM studied that world the way he had once studied the train loaded with wheat and cattle, searching for the weak points in the system. What he lacked in capital, he made up for in audacity. With a few borrowed shillings and the trust of some friends, he began trading in livestock and grain, moving between rural markets and the city. He knew how to talk to farmers. He spoke their language, remembered their hunger, their resentment of middlemen who cheated them. Slowly, painfully, the profits grew. A bicycle became a second-hand truck. A rented room became a small office. A whispered rumor about a former detainee doing well became a name people recognized. And then came the first twist. One evening, in the smoky back room of a downtown bar, JM was serving drinks to a group of men deep in conversation. Their voices were low, but the names they dropped were loud. Kenyatta, Cow, Lancaster House. The men around the table were not just drinking. They were sketching the outlines of the next government, counting constituencies like poker chips. JM hovered nearby, topping up glasses, eyes and ears open. A hand clapped his shoulder. "Young man," one of them said, looking up. "You were in detention, weren't you?" "Mau Mau." The room fell a little quieter. For some, Mau Mau still meant terrorist. For others, it meant patriot. JM nodded cautiously. "Yes." The man's gaze sharpened. "Then you should not be here only serving drinks. We will need people who know what this fight was really about." He introduced himself as an ally of Jomo Kenyatta, recently released from his own long imprisonment. Within weeks, JM found himself drawn into a tighter circle, running errands, organizing meetings, arranging transport and food when community halls filled beyond capacity for rallies. His experience in business helped. He could negotiate prices, keep records, stretch every shilling further than anyone else expected. For the first time, he wasn't just listening to politics from the edge of the room. He was inside the machine, watching it turn. The closer he moved to the nationalist leadership, the more he saw that they were not a single unified bloc. There were radicals who wanted immediate land seizures and a full break with Britain. There were moderates who preferred a careful transition, protecting foreign investments to avoid economic collapse. Old resentments between ethnic groups, between educated elites and former detainees, simmered beneath speeches about unity. And one day, at a rally planning meeting, he walked into a crowded office and saw Karanja. The boy from school, the interpreter from the camp, was different again. The nervousness JM remembered from their last encounter was gone. Karanja stood at the center of a small group, talking animatedly to a man in a crisp suit. A British advisor, from the look of him. He wore a tailored jacket, a watch that glinted when he moved his wrist. The easy confidence of someone who believed he belonged in any room he entered. Their eyes met, a flicker of recognition. Then Karanja smiled, that same smooth, careful smile from their childhood classrooms. "JM," he said, walking over, spreading his arms as if greeting an old friend. "So you found your way into politics as well?" "Politics found me," JM replied, wary. You seem to be doing well. Karanja's shrug was elegant. I kept working when others chose the forest or the camps. Someone had to keep the files moving, the negotiations going. These independence talks, they will not run on slogans alone. Behind him, JM noticed a British official glance their way, then back to the papers. Karanja followed JM's gaze and lowered his voice. Listen, things are moving quickly. The British trust people like me. The nationalists trust people like Kenyatta. Those of us who can stand in the middle, we will shape what Kenya becomes. You and I, we're not boys anymore. It's time to think about where we want to sit when the music stops. There it was, loyalty versus freedom all over again, but now wrapped in the language of negotiation and nation-building. For now they worked on the same side, at least on paper. Both attended rallies where Kenyatta spoke of Harambee, of pulling together. Both helped draft statements, organize delegations, calm angry crowds when rumors of betrayal or delays in the talks spread like fire. But even in those early days, the difference between them grew sharper. Karanja cultivated relationships with civil servants, with British officers who quietly admitted that the sun was setting on the empire and wanted to secure their own futures. He spoke the language of stability, continuity, orderly transition. JM, by contrast, built his network from the ground up. In the bustling alleys of Nairobi's markets, in the dusty queues outside land offices in the countryside, in tiny churches where congregations sang with more faith than food, his name began to circulate. This was the man who had been in detention, the man who still wore dust on his shoes when he came to speak, the man who listened. There was a deadline hanging over all of it, the date of independence. Every negotiation at Lancaster House, every constitutional draft, every boundary line between new constituencies was a race against that invisible clock. The British wanted guarantees. The nationalist elite wanted positions. Ordinary Kenyans wanted assurances that uhuru, freedom, would mean something more than a new flag. In 1963, as the tricolour flag of Kenya was raised and the Union Jack lowered, fireworks lit the sky over Nairobi. Crowds danced in the streets, singing until their voices cracked. JM stood among them, his face wet with tears he didn't bother to hide. He remembered the camp, the slap in the settler's house, the train of wealth rattling past starving children. For a heartbeat, it felt like all of that suffering had been worth it. Then, almost immediately, the next question crashed down. Now what? Kenya needed a government, a cabinet, a parliament, people to run ministries, to manage money, to decide who got land, loans, contracts. The struggle shifted from the forests and the negotiating tables to ballot boxes and back rooms. This was where JM made his boldest move yet. While some former detainees stayed in the shadows, content with minor posts or small business opportunities, JM went straight for the heart of power. He ran for a parliamentary seat in Nyandarua, a region full of land-hungry settlers and displaced African farmers. It was a place where the promises of uhuru would be tested hardest, where the gap between expectation and reality could explode. His campaign was a blur of dust, drums, and furious hope. He moved from village to village in a battered truck, standing on the back to address gatherings under acacia trees. His speeches were not polished, they were raw, full of stories more than statistics. He talked about the train that had carried wheat past starving children, about the camp where men were beaten for asking questions, about the need to make sure independence did not just change the color of the men who gave orders. Freedom, he told one gathering, is not a song you sing once on a night of fireworks. It is food in your stomach, land you can plant without fear, a school where your children can sit in the front row, not only in the back. Word spread. Old women who had never learned to read traced his name in the dust. Young men argued about his chances late into the night, under skyfuls of cold stars. The established local chiefs, some of whom had collaborated with the colonial administration, muttered that he was dangerous, that he would stir up trouble. He won. Suddenly, the barefoot herd boy was Honourable Josiah Mwangi Kariuki, Member of Parliament. Inside the new house, its benches still smelling of fresh polish and new cloth, he took his seat with the weight of thousands of expectations on his shoulders. For a moment it seemed like the rivalry with Karanja might finally fade. After all, both were now part of the ruling party, KANU. Both publicly pledged loyalty to President Kenyatta, the father of the nation. Both could claim, in their own way, to have helped bring Kenya to independence. But in politics, proximity to power is everything. And here, Karanja moved faster, leveraging his old contacts, his reputation as a moderate, and his skill at navigating bureaucracy, Karanja secured a position inside the State House as a senior aide, an advisor with access not just to ministers, but to the president himself. His office had a view of manicured lawns and the city skyline beyond. Files bearing the names of parastatals, banks, and foreign investors crossed his desk. JM, meanwhile, balanced his parliamentary duties with his growing business ventures. His taverns and hotels became informal political salons, places where MPs, civil servants, and foreign journalists mingled with truck drivers and market women. Deals were struck in the same rooms where freedom songs were sung late into the night. Money flowed, and with it a new kind of power. The twist came when Kenyatta, impressed by JM's popularity and organizational ability, invited him into his inner circle as a personal secretary and political confidant. It was a role Karanja had believed was his by right. For the first time, JM and Karanja found themselves not just on parallel paths, but colliding inside the same small orbit around the president. In closed-door meetings, they sat on opposite sides of polished tables, their faces politely neutral as land settlement schemes were, discussed as foreign aid packages were negotiated, as lists of potential appointees to key posts were read out loud. On paper, they shared the same goals. In practice, every decision became another silent contest. Karanja argued for caution. "We must not scare away investors," he would say smoothly. "We need stability. We cannot give land to everyone at once. The state must remain strong." JM pressed for urgency. "What good is stability," he countered, "if it means the same few own everything while the many are told to wait and wait and wait? We did not suffer in detention to become beggars in our own country." The clock that had once counted down to independence now counted something else. How long could JM keep pushing before the system he had helped to build turned on him? Because as the 1960s rolled into the early 1970s, a dark pattern emerged. Government contracts went to the same connected names. Land that had once belonged to settlers was snapped up not by the landless, but by ministers, senior officials, businessmen who never had dirt under their nails. New estates rose on former settler farms, their gates guarded, their lawns watered, while in overcrowded villages, families still queued for a few dusty acres. JM saw it up close, invitations to housewarmings where the wine was imported and the laughter was loud, conversations where men who had once preached sacrifice now boasted about the number of plots they owned, the size of their bank accounts overseas. In those rooms the word comrade faded. A new word took its place: shareholder. Karanja flourished in this environment. He became the quiet architect behind certain deals, the man foreign companies and ambitious local elites sought out to smooth the way. His loyalty was rewarded with directorships, a growing portfolio of discreet investments, and even more influence over who rose and who fell. JM, meanwhile, started to feel something else growing around him: suspicion. He still spoke to the poor, visited remote areas, allowed people to crowd his office until the corridor outside was packed with petitioners. He lent money he knew might never be repaid. He attended funerals in forgotten villages where no minister had set foot since independence. To his supporters, he was becoming a symbol of the promises of Uhuru that were being betrayed. To those now feasting at the top, he was becoming a problem. The tension exploded one evening when, after a long day of meetings that went nowhere, JM confronted Karanja in a State House corridor. "You remember what they told us in school?" JM asked quietly. "That loyalty would get us freedom and more." Karanja tilted his head, weighing the question. "It has," he said, unflinching. "Look around you. We are no longer servants on settler farms. We run this country. Do we?" JM's voice was low, dangerous. "Or have we just taken the settler's place at the head of the table?" For a moment, the air between them crackled. Then Karanja leaned in, his tone almost gentle. "You are playing a dangerous game, JM. These speeches, these visits to the slums, this talk of land and justice, it makes you popular. Too popular. You think the people in those rooms with the imported wine will sit quietly while you turn the masses against them." JM thought of the camp, of the slaps, of the trains of wealth. He thought of independence nights and village rallies. And he made another decision that would change his life. "I didn't come into politics to be rich," he said. "I came to make sure that slap never lands on our children's faces again." Karanja smiled, but there was no warmth in it now. "Then you have less time than you think." There it was, the new deadline, unspoken but real. Not a colonial emergency decree, not a date circled in red on a British calendar, but a ticking clock counting down to the moment when JM's moral courage would collide head-on with the interests of men who had grown used to eating well. In parliamentary corridors, whispers began. JM was reckless, too radical, a demagogue. At markets and bus stops, different whispers spread. JM was our man, the only one who tells the truth. The stage was set for a confrontation bigger than anything he had faced in the forests, in the camps, or even at independence. It would not be a battle of guns, but of words, dangerous words that could strip the mask off an entire system in a single unforgettable sentence. And as dawn broke over Nairobi one particular morning, JM buttoned his shirt, looked at himself in the mirror, and knew that by the time the sun set, he might either have changed the course of Kenyan politics, or signed his own political death warrant, perhaps. Something even worse with the speech he was about to deliver. That morning, Nairobi woke up as if nothing in the world was about to change. Milk boys clattered along the streets with metal cans, slums steamed with charcoal fires and weak tea, and civil servants in clean shirts rehearsed safe phrases for the day's meetings. Somewhere, a new minister slid into the leather-back seat of his government Mercedes, the smell of fresh polish wrapping around him like a promise, and walking on foot past the same building, with dust on his shoes and a single sheet of folded paper in his pocket, was the man whose words would slice through all that comfort like a knife. JM had not slept much. The sentence that refused to leave his mind had kept him awake, glowing in the dark like a forbidden flame. He had written it, crossed it out, written it again. Each time the letters came out sharper, angrier, truer. Kenya is becoming a country of 10 millionaires and 10 million beggars. He knew what that line meant. It was not just criticism, it was an accusation. It pointed a finger, not at colonialism or history, but at the men he now worked with, ate with, shook hands with every day. Men like Karanja. In the mirror that morning, JM had watched his own face carefully as he buttoned his shirt. He tried to imagine it later that day. After the speech, after the reaction, he could already feel gathering like a storm. Would there be relief, regret, fear? All he saw was a tightness around his eyes and a strange calm. Time suddenly was not an endless political career stretching into the distance. It was one day, one speech, one shot. Inside Parliament, the air was thick with the smell of paper, ink, and nervous cologne. MPs shuffled into their seats, exchanging jokes and whispers. On the government benches, some men lounged with the lazy confidence of people who believed history had already crowned them winners. On the opposition benches, small, scattered, a few heads turned toward JM with curiosity. He was a member of the ruling party after all. Why had he asked to speak? Karanja sat in the public gallery that day, high above the chamber, in a row reserved for senior officials. From up there he could see everything. The set of JM's shoulders, the way he clutched his notes, the barely suppressed impatience. In the eyes of certain ministers, he leaned back, fingers steepled, as the speaker finally called JM's name. The chamber quieted. JM rose, his heart thudding, the paper in his hand suddenly feeling very small compared to the weight of what it carried. He looked around, at the carved wood, the flags, the men in suits who had once been prisoners, rebels, clerks, laborers. He remembered some of their faces contorted in pain on detention camp yards. Now they sat with gold pens and full bellies. He began slowly. He spoke of the struggle for uhuru, of promises made under gallows and in crowded cells. Heads nodded. This was safe territory. He thanked the president for leading the nation through the difficult years after independence. Faces relaxed. A few ministers glanced at their watches. Then his tone shifted. He described a woman in Nyandarua who walked 15 kilometers to beg for medicine for her child, while, a few miles away, an official's new farmhouse boasted a swimming pool that shimmered under the sun. He told of maize rotting in government stores while children in the countryside went to bed on empty stomachs. He listed, without names but with excruciating detail, how land that was supposed to be redistributed to the landless had somehow found its way into the hands of a small, well-connected group of patriots who seemed to confuse the word freedom with private property. Murmurs began. Some MPs shifted uneasily. Others stared at him, expressionless. And then he said it. "We were not jailed. We were not beaten. We did not see our brothers shot," he declared, his voice rising, "so that Kenya could become a country of 10 millionaires and 10 million beggars." The sentence hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence. Even the clerks stopped writing. Somewhere in the gallery, a journalist's pen froze above his notebook, ink pooling. Then sound returned in fragments. A few MPs slapped their desks in approval, more out of instinct than calculation. Others hissed under their breath. One minister half rose, red-faced, ready to shout him down, then thought better of it under the speaker's gaze. Up in the gallery, Karanja did not move. His eyes, however, were very, very awake. JM went on, the words tumbling out faster now, fueled by the shock he had created. He called for an end to corruption, for transparent land registers, for government companies to be run not as private hunting grounds, but as public institutions. He demanded that those who had grown fat on the spoils of independence explain themselves to the people. He did not mention names. He did not have to. By the time he finished, his throat was raw and his shirt clung to his back with sweat. Applause broke out, scattered but intense, quickly drowned by the scraping of chairs as some senior figures stood up and stalked out of the chamber. Outside, word moved faster than cars. That phrase, 10 millionaires and 10 million beggars, sprinted through ministries, down staircases, across crowded buses. By lunchtime, it was being repeated in markets, in barbershops, in university corridors. Some people laughed at the exaggeration. Others whispered that it was not an exaggeration at all. By evening, it had reached State House. JM was summoned. The drive up the long, tree-lined avenue felt unreal. He watched the manicured lawns glide past, remembered the way his bare feet had once cracked on dry village soil, and wondered if this would be the last time he saw this place from the inside. In the cool, dim waiting room, under the gaze of official portraits, he found Karanja already there, seated comfortably, a file on his lap. "So," Karanja said softly, when they were briefly alone, "you decided to throw the stone." JM met his eyes. "Someone needed to break the glass." "The glass," Karanja replied, almost amused, "is the only thing standing between this country and chaos. You think you're speaking for the poor? Fine, but remember, those millionaires you talk about can do more than just clap and hiss. They can close doors. They can write laws. They can misplace people." The word hung in the air with deliberate vagueness. Before JM could answer, an aide opened the door and beckoned him in. President Kenyatta was older, heavier, his hair grey, but his presence still filled the room. He listened as JM repeated, in calmer terms, the concerns from his speech. Kenyatta's eyes were hooded, his fingers drumming the arm of his chair. "JM," he said finally, his voice slow, "you have always been passionate. That is why I liked you. That is why I brought you close. But passion can burn down a house as easily as it can warm it." He leaned forward. "You have made powerful enemies today. I can protect you from some things, but not everything. The country is fragile. We cannot have young men inciting the masses. You want change? Work from inside, calmly, quietly. No more of those dramatic sentences." There it was again, an offer and a warning, fused together. "You have until the next party conference," Kenyatta added, "to show that you are with us, not against us. Do you understand?" A clock ticked on the wall behind him, each second suddenly loud. "Yes, Mzee," JM said. "I understand." He understood, more clearly than ever, that his time was shrinking. The weeks that followed were a strange mix of threat and opportunity. On one hand, state newspapers didn't print his speech. When they did mention it, they sanded down its sharpest edges. Some of his business licenses were delayed. Officials who had once greeted him with hugs now gave tight smiles and said they were very busy. On the other hand, his popularity on the ground exploded. In Nyandarua, people repeated his words like a prayer and a joke at the same time. 10 millionaires and 10 million beggars. They shouted when he arrived in dusty trading centers, pounding his car with open palms in wild welcome. University students painted the phrase on campus walls at night, before police washed it off in the morning. In slums where sewage trickled past packed shacks, his name was shouted whenever someone talked about rising food prices or unpaid wages. JM leaned into this energy, but he did not let it drown him. He knew slogans alone would not build a country, so he worked. He used his business network to start small development projects in his constituency. A cooperative to help farmers buy fertilizer at fair prices, a revolving fund for widows to start market stalls, a scheme where his hotel kitchens bought produce directly from smallholders instead of big middlemen. The profits from his taverns in Nairobi helped pay school fees for bright children who would otherwise have abandoned education after primary school. At rallies he still spoke fire, But in committee rooms and late-night meetings, he negotiated, calculated, pushed for practical changes. He argued for the release of remaining political detainees. He pressured ministries to allocate more money to rural clinics. When he sat in his cramped parliamentary office, the queue outside was endless. Squatters with crumpled letters, workers with grievances, students with petitions. They called him JM, with a familiarity they would never use for other senior politicians. The line between his public and private life blurred until it all became one long, exhausting shift. The ruling elite watched this with a mix of admiration and fear. They could not deny his effectiveness. They did not like where it was heading, so they tried a different tactic. One afternoon, he was called not to State House, but to the office of a key minister, a man known for his ability to turn problems into allies. "My brother," the minister boomed, hands spread wide, "you are too talented to be wasted shouting from the back benches. We need you in government, real government." He offered JM a position as an assistant minister, not in some dull technical department, but in tourism and wildlife, a glamorous portfolio tied to foreign exchange and international image. It was a clever move. Tourism was a growing industry. Safaris, beach hotels, national parks, these were places where money flowed, quietly and in large amounts. It was also a ministry where he could be paraded as proof that the system rewarded outspoken young patriots. JM accepted. He did so not because he was dazzled by the idea of hotel banquets with foreign visitors, he had seen enough banquets already, but because he believed he could bend that stream of money to touch the people who never saw the inside of a luxury lodge. He threw himself into the job. He insisted that communities living near game reserves be given a share of park revenues. He pushed for training programs so that tour guides, hotel managers, even airline staff would not be flown in from abroad while Kenyan graduates sat idle. He argued that conservation could not mean fencing off land, while pastoralists were squeezed into smaller and smaller patches. Sometimes he won. A new training college would open here, a community project would be funded there. His name began appearing positively in foreign travel magazines. Journalists liked the story of the former detainee now selling his country's beauty to the world. But every gain came with resistance. Foreign hotel chains complained that he was unrealistic. Local elites grumbled that he was interfering in private investment. In boardrooms where he was not invited, his rival rebuilt his image. "This JM," Karanja would say calmly, "is becoming dangerous. He is no longer just a popular MP. He is building a power base, in business, in parliament, in the streets. He uses his ministry not to attract investors, but to shame them. If he is not checked before the next election, he could become unpredictable." The next election. That was the new date circled in invisible ink on the political calendar. If JM cruised through it with another landslide, his moral authority would be almost impossible to contain. If they blocked him before then, they risked public explosion. The solution, they decided, was to suffocate him politically, without making a martyr of him. The first sign came quietly. He was dropped from certain committees to give others a chance. Then a key speech he was scheduled to deliver at an international tourism conference was reassigned to another minister at the last minute. Rumors spread in his constituency that he had abandoned them for city life, that he cared more about tourists than farmers. Karanja's fingerprints were never visible. They did not need to be. Then, just before party nominations for the election, the blow fell. JM's name was missing from the official list of approved KANU candidates for Nyandarua. In his place, a little-known local administrator who had spent the independent struggle safely behind a desk. The message was clear: toe the line, or you will not even be allowed to stand. But the men who crafted that plan had underestimated how deep JM's roots now ran. When word reached Nyandarua, fury erupted. Farmers who had benefited from his cooperatives, women whose children he had helped through school, young men who had found work in his businesses, they swarmed local party offices, chanting, singing, refusing to disperse. Squatters marched with placards painted in muddy letters. "We want JM." Village elders who had never set foot in Nairobi boarded buses, determined to protest directly. Police were dispatched to maintain order. Tear gas drifted over fields where, just days before, children had been playing. Under pressure, the party reversed itself. A second list emerged. JM's name was back on it. The government had tried to suffocate him. Instead, they had made him look untouchable. The election that followed turned the tension into raw numbers. In dusty schoolrooms turned into polling stations, old women leaned on sticks to cast their votes. Young men who had once shrugged at politics queued for hours. When the ballot boxes were opened and the counting dragged through the night, it was not even close. JM crushed his challenger. As the final results were announced at dawn, he stood on the back of a truck, exhausted but radiant, the sun rising behind him over the hills of Nyandarua. The crowd roared his name. Somewhere in the city, a different group of men stared grimly at the same figures and said nothing. He returned to Parliament with a mandate stronger than ever, and with an even smaller margin for error. He spoke more boldly now, not just about inequality, but about detention without trial, about the need for genuine opposition, about the way fear had begun to creep back into Kenyan life, this time not wearing a British uniform, but a local one. He visited universities where students packed lecture halls just to hear him talk. He sat cross-legged on hostel floors, listening to their anger, their restlessness. In those rooms, under bare bulbs that flickered with unreliable electricity, he heard a new generation ask the question that had chased him since release from the camp. Is this the freedom we fought for? He did not have a simple answer, but he refused to lie. Freedom is not a gift you are given once, he told them. It is something you must keep taking care of, like a cow, like a field. If you leave it to others, they will milk it dry and fence it in. The students cheered. Security officials listening through informers did not. The file with his name on it, in some grey government building, grew thicker. Reports were added. Addressed student rally, critical of government. Met with trade union leaders. Spoke to foreign journalists. Conversations in high offices slid from irritation to cold calculation. One evening, as he left a late meeting in the city and stepped into the humid darkness of the parking lot, a man he vaguely recognized from years back at State House detached himself from the shadows. Meshimiwa, the man said quietly, glancing around, I should not be talking to you, but I remember what you did for my cousin when he was in trouble, so listen. He lowered his voice further. They are no longer just angry with you. They are afraid of you. There is a list. Your name is on it. You have months, not years. Leave, go abroad for a while, or slow down. The words fell heavily between them, more convincing than any official warning. JM drove home that night with his hands clenched on the steering wheel, headlights carving thin tunnels through the dark. His wife watched him pace the living room, silent, the children asleep in their rooms. Friends came and went over the next few days, some urging caution, others telling him to fight on, their own fear leaking through, their voices even as they tried to be brave. There were options. He could accept a quieter role. He could decline invitations to rallies. He could, as some suggested, go for medical treatment abroad for a year or two, returning when things had cooled. He thought of the woman in Nyandarua who had walked 15 kilometers for medicine. He thought of the boys in university dormitories, arguing about their future under flickering bulbs. He thought of the camp, of the settlers' slap, of the train rolling past hungry children. In the end, the decision did not feel like a heroic choice. It was simply the only one that allowed him to look at his own face in the mirror without flinching. He stayed, he spoke, he pushed harder, and somewhere, not far from the routes he drove and the podiums he climbed onto, other men, some in uniform, some in suits, some behind tidy desks, began to plan the timetable for a very different kind of journey, one whose final destination JM would not choose. The clock that had once counted down to independence, to elections, to party conferences, now ticked towards something darker, more final, and as yet unseen. But for the moment he was still in motion, a man racing against time, against fear, against the comfortable lies of his own comrades, determined, for as long as the seconds allowed, to keep shouting the truth in a room that had learned to fear it. The first lie was simple. Honorable Kariuki is in Zambia. It sounded harmless enough when it was first whispered in a government corridor, written in careful handwriting on a small scrap of paper slid across a polished desk. A minister read it, frowned, then nodded. Yes, Zambia, that would do. Not dead, not missing. Just abroad. Outside, the city still moved as if nothing had cracked. Buses coughed black smoke into the air. Street vendors shouted the price of oranges and roasted maize. In the leafy suburbs, sprinklers ticked rhythmically over lawns, while maids pegged white shirts to clotheslines. But in one house at the edge of Nairobi, a phone sat on a table and did not ring. JM's wife stared at it as if she could force it to come alive by sheer will. The last time she had seen him, he had been standing in that very doorway, adjusting his tie in the glass, his mind already somewhere else. Just one meeting, he had said. I won't be late. He was rarely on time, always squeezed between commitments like a man trying to outrun his own shadow. But he always came back. That night, the clock on the wall kept ticking and the door stayed closed. In the days before his disappearance, time had felt like a tightening net. The warning from the loyal official, the hushed visits from friends, the sense that the invisible list with his name on it was no longer just a piece of paper, but a calendar counting down. He responded the only way he knew, by going faster. He filled his days to the brim. Mornings in Parliament, hurling questions that made ministers shuffle their papers and avoid his eyes. Afternoons in his ministry, arguing over budgets, signing files, pushing for projects that had been postponed for years. Evenings in smoky halls or open fields, speaking to farmers, students, union workers. Late nights at his desk, drafting notes for a report that he believed would be his most explosive yet. A document laying out, in plain language, how land, money and power had been quietly diverted into the pockets of a small group. His friends begged him to slow down. "They are not joking, JM," one colleague said, gripping his arm so hard it hurt. "They are afraid people listen to you, afraid you don't scare easily, afraid you know too much. People who are afraid do stupid things." JM shook him off gently. "If I stop now," he replied, "what was all this for? The camp, the years, the beatings? So that I can retire to a farm and keep quiet? No. If there is a price, let's at least make it worth something." The price was already being calculated in offices he would never see. Karanja watched the accelerating schedule with a cold, professional eye. He saw the packed rallies, the newspaper articles written by foreign correspondents, fascinated by the charismatic minister who refused to toe the line, the students who whispered JM's name like a password. He listened to reports of the report, that thick, dangerous file being prepared in the ministry, full of uncomfortable questions, and even more uncomfortable facts. "This man," he told a small circle of trusted allies one evening, "is not just a critic. He is a fuse. If you let him burn long enough, he will reach the explosives. And then the whole house goes up, including the room we are sitting in now." They spoke in euphemisms: stability, security, the national interest. But underneath those respectable words lay a blunt reality. Power was slipping, and they intended to hold on to it by any means available. The options were weighed. Strip him of his ministry again? They had tried that before, and he had come back stronger, crowned by the people rather than by appointment. Arrest him. Detention without trial was still a weapon in their arsenal, but this time the target was not an unknown activist. He was a national figure, a hero to some, a troublemaker to others, but undeniably visible. Exile him? Too obvious, too slow. There remained one option that could not be written down on any file, that could never be discussed in an official meeting, but that hovered in the air like the smell of diesel outside a generator room. When the idea finally crossed Karanja's lips, softly, almost experimentally, there was a moment of silence in the room. No one looked directly at anyone else. Then, one by one, men nodded, very slightly. It would have to be done cleanly, quickly, with confusion wrapped tightly around it like a shroud. In the last week of his life, JM looked more tired than even he would admit. The constant moving, the late nights, the strain of knowing that something was closing in without being able to see its exact shape. It all carved new lines into his face, yet he seemed, in another way, almost lighter. One night, sitting at his dining table long after the children were asleep, he told his wife about a dream he had had. "I was back in the camp," he said, stirring cold tea he had no intention of drinking. Same fence, same guards, same smell. But when they called my name to go for the beating, I stood up and no one followed me. The whole line refused to move. Even the guards looked confused. "Maybe it means you should rest," she suggested, trying to keep her voice steady. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe it means that sometimes one person has to walk, even if he's not sure anyone is behind him." On the day he disappeared, Nairobi's heat lay over the city, thick as a wool blanket. Cars honked impatiently in the traffic, choking the streets around the city centre. Inside the Norfolk Hotel, ceiling fans pushed warm air in lazy circles above businessmen in short-sleeved shirts and tourists in safari hats. JM was seen there that afternoon, laughing with acquaintances, gesturing widely as he explained some point. A waiter remembers refilling his glass. A lobby clerk remembers him pausing to scribble a phone number on the back of a business card. A security guard remembers the black car that rolled up outside, its windows darkened. "Honorable, your ride is here," someone called. He picked up his jacket, slid his papers into a worn leather folder, and walked out. It was, in many ways, an ordinary moment. A man getting into a car on a hot day, headed, he believed, to yet another meeting, another argument, another attempt to push the boulder of reform 1 inch up the hill. The door closed, the car pulled away. No one in the hotel lobby knew that they had just watched the last few seconds of his public life. What exactly happened next in that car, on that road, in that quiet place where they eventually stopped? Those details would later be reconstructed from fragments, rumors, and the reluctant testimonies of men who would have preferred silence. A car switch, perhaps, a change of drivers, a detour away from the busy routes towards the thin, dusty tracks that led out of the city, a conversation that began politely and turned suddenly sharp, a request to cooperate, hands reaching out, not in greeting, but to hold him down. Gunshots are deafening in a confined space. 3 of them, according to the post-mortem report that would later leak. 1 into the chest, 1 into the head, 1 through the arm as he tried to shield himself. The body was discarded like contraband. In the chill of the Ngong Hills forest, between whispering trees and low shrubs, they dragged him out and left him there, his face, partially burned with acid, not to cause pain, that part was already over, but to erase, to blur, to turn a man who had filled halls with his voice into an unrecognizable object on the forest floor. Then they drove back to the city, merging again with the traffic, the noise, the smoke, slipping into their lives as if they had just returned from any ordinary assignment. In Nairobi, the first hours after his disappearance were marked not by sirens, but by uncertainty. His wife called friends, friends called ministries, ministers called assistants, assistants called drivers. Everyone hoped someone else had seen him last, that there would be a simple explanation, a delayed meeting, a broken car, a sudden trip. The ruling clique moved quickly to shape the narrative. "JM?" a senior official said, smiling too broadly when asked. "He travels a lot. You know him, always moving. I am sure he is fine." By the second day, the whisper had become a line. "He has gone to Zambia." No one could produce a flight number, but there were supposedly important contacts to be met, business opportunities to be discussed. It was the kind of vague explanation that sounded, at first, like a plausible excuse from a busy politician. But the people who knew him best heard something else in that silence. In Nyandarua, men who had seen him almost every week for years looked up at the hills and felt a coldness settle, not on their skin, but in their bones. At the University of Nairobi, students who had packed halls to hear him speak asked one another the question no one wanted to say. Out loud, what if he is not just missing? What if he has been made to disappear? The truth waited in the forest. On the third day, a group of herdsmen walked their cattle through the slopes of the Ngong Hills. They were used to strange objects in the bush, discarded bottles, rusted metal, the occasional carcass of an animal that had fallen, or been mauled by predators. What they were not used to seeing was a suit. The body lay twisted in the grass, the clothes expensive but torn, the shoes caked with mud. The face was damaged, the features blurred, but the hands, those hands that had once clenched around prison bars, around microphones, around stacks of documents, were unmistakably human, fingers curled as if still holding on to something. The herdsman went to the nearest police post. The policeman on duty went pale when he heard the description. A call went up the chain. Within hours, a small convoy of unmarked cars climbed the road to the forest. Men in plain clothes walked among the trees, heads bent, not in sorrow, but in calculation. Photographs were taken, measurements muttered. The body was examined, then quickly moved, wrapped not in honor, but in urgency. That afternoon, in a hospital mortuary, a sheet was pulled back for identification. A relative stepped forward. For a moment, the damage to the face did its work, turning the familiar into something alien, wrong. Then the details anchored him. A scar on the hand, the shape of the jaw, some small, unburned portion of skin that looked exactly like the man they loved. There are screams that never make it into official records. News does not travel at a steady speed. It runs faster on certain roads. Within hours, the word "JM is dead" streaked through Nairobi like a bolt of lightning. It crackled through bars, through markets, through bus stations. It leapt the fences of elite residences and rolled through the corridors of cheap hostels. In offices, people suddenly found urgent reasons to go home early. On street corners, faces gathered around the single copy of a newspaper, searching for confirmation that was not yet there. The government moved to manage the explosion. State radio read a brief, stiff statement. Honorable Josiah Mwangi Kariuki, a distinguished patriot, had been found dead. An investigation would be launched. The president was shocked and saddened. He was not the only one. In Parliament, where JM's chair sat empty, the shock quickly mixed with something hotter. Backbenchers who had once murmured their support for him privately now found their voices rising in public. They demanded answers. Who had last seen him? Why had no one taken his disappearance seriously? Who had invented the story about Zambia? The speaker's gavel struggled to contain the uproar. Outside, the city erupted. Students at the University of Nairobi poured out of lecture halls in a wave. They marched towards the center, chanting his name, his famous line about 10 millionaires and 10 million beggars, now twisted into a funeral chant. Workers left factories to join them. Shopkeepers closed their shutters. People climbed onto trucks and buses, waving branches, banners, whatever they could grab. The protest grew into a moving, roaring animal made of thousands of throats and 4,000 pairs of feet. They headed towards Parliament, towards the heart of the system they believed had killed him. The response was swift. Police lines formed across key streets, shields raised, batons ready. Tear gas canisters arced through the air, hissing as they landed. The white smoke billowed, stinging eyes, burning lungs, making people cough and retch. Stones flew in return, hitting helmets, smashing windscreens. In that chaos of smoke and shouting, of sirens and falling bodies, something irreversible happened. Fear shifted. It no longer flowed only from the people upwards to the authorities. It pulsed back downwards as well. In State House, Kenyatta listened to reports of the unrest with a face carved from stone. Whether he had authorized what had happened to JM, whether he had simply allowed others to act in the shadow of his power, whether he himself had been bypassed. These are questions historians still argue over. What is certain is that he understood the scale of the wound. To calm the storm, he deployed one of the few weapons still trusted by a public that was learning painfully to doubt: a commission of inquiry. A panel was announced, chaired by a judge with a reputation for integrity. Public hearings would be held, witnesses called, evidence considered. The truth, the official line promised, would be sought. For the first time in independent Kenya, the high drama of power and death would unfold not just in secret offices, but under bright lights, microphones, the public's gaze. The hearings became their own kind of theater. Civil servants, policemen, drivers, hotel staff, all were called to answer questions. Some sweated under the glare, contradicting themselves within minutes. Others, who had thought their role invisible, discovered that anonymity was slippery. The story of the Zambia lie was exposed. It had not been a misunderstanding. It had been manufactured. Senior officials' signatures appeared on memos that now looked obscene in retrospect. Under pressure, a line of responsibility began to form, running through the security services, bending towards the highest offices in the land. Names close to Kenyatta were whispered in queues, printed in cautious foreign reports, discussed in low voices over dinner tables. Karanja's name came up again and again, never as the man who pulled the trigger, but as the one who had argued, in room after quiet room, that JM was a danger. He sat in a neat suit when he appeared before the commission, his expression controlled. "I had political differences with Honorable Kariuki," he said, voice even. "Yes, we debated policies, but assassination? Never. I would never support such barbaric methods. We fought for independence to end that kind of thing." Some believed him. Others watched the tightness at the corner of his mouth and heard, behind the careful phrases, the echo of that earlier warning to JM. They can misplace people. The commission's report, when it finally emerged, did not name him directly as the architect. It pointed instead at specific officers, mid-level figures in the security services. It spoke of high-level involvement, without always saying which levels, which names. It was more honesty than any previous Kenyan government inquiry had delivered. It was also less than many hoped for. A few men were arrested, tried, convicted. None of them had sat in cabinet meetings. None of them had driven the luxury cars or signed the land deals that JM had denounced. The real architecture of power remained intact, but something had shifted under its foundations. Kenyatta's government emerged bruised. The aura of untouchable legitimacy that had wrapped the founding father like a cloak was torn. JM's empty chair in Parliament became an accusation in wood and leather. His grave in Nyandarua became a pilgrimage site where, on certain days, lines of people stretched across the red earth, carrying flowers, prayers, anger. Time moved, as it always does. Kenyatta himself would die a few years later, in his sleep, the nation once again going through the rituals of mourning and succession. New faces would step into old offices. New slogans would be painted on old walls. For a while, some of the men most closely linked to JM's death would retreat from public view, nursing their fortunes, waiting. Karanja, though damaged, did not disappear. He resurfaced in various roles, advisory, informal, always somewhere near the center of decision-making. But he never fully escaped the shadow of the man he had helped silence. At public events, he could feel the weight of certain stares on his back. In conversations, his name sometimes appeared in the same sentence as JM's, followed by a meaningful pause. He had power, yes, but the cost of that power had stained him in ways no amount of polished speeches could quite scrub away. Meanwhile, JM's presence grew in absence. His phrase about 10 millionaires and 10 million beggars refused to die. It appeared graffitied on walls by a new generation of youth who had not been born when he walked the earth. It was quoted by opposition politicians challenging later governments, by poets writing about slums where children still played beside, open sewers, by students in essays about inequality. Schools were named after him. Roads. A small dusty library in Nyandarua kept a photograph of him on the wall, his eyes bright, his tie slightly crooked, as if he had just rushed in from another meeting. In the 1990s, when Kenyans once again flooded the streets to demand multi-party democracy, some of the oldest among them carried not just new placards, but old memories. They remembered the funeral in 1975, when the crowd had surged like a sea, when people had cried not only for JM, but for something larger, the betrayal of the promise of Uhuru. They remembered the fear, the tear gas, the curt statements on state radio. As they marched against new injustices, his name surfaced again, chanted in rhythm with those of freshly arrested reformers. In police reports on the demonstrations, he appeared like a ghost. Protesters shouted slogans, referring to the late Josiah Mwangi Kariuki. Even in the corridors of power, where people prefer their ghosts neatly contained in portraits, his story refused to stay still. New presidents, facing their own scandals, occasionally quoted him in speeches about fighting corruption. They spoke his words with the ease of people who hoped that invoking him might cloak them in his moral authority, even as they presided over the same long queues at government offices, the same unpaid workers, the same swelling fortunes among a small elite. Journalists wrote anniversary pieces. What would JM say today? They asked, pointing at headlines about missing billions, at photographs of shiny shopping malls rising next to corrugated iron roof slums. Historians, digging through dusty files and yellowing newspapers, tried to fit his life into neat categories. Nationalist, businessman, populist, socialist, capitalist, none of the labels quite held. He had been, at different times, all of these and none of them. What united his contradictions was not ideology, but an insistence that the country had to be more than a playground for the few. In Nyandarua, old men sat under trees and told stories to children who had only ever known JM as a name on a sign. He came here when the road was still just mud, one would say. He stood on that rock there and talked until his voice was hoarse. He helped my daughter go to school, another would add. When the school fees letter came, we went to his office in Nairobi. We thought we would wait the whole day, but when he heard why we had come, he saw us in 10 minutes. He didn't even let us finish talking. He just wrote a check. Why did they kill him? A child would ask, eyes wide. The answers varied. Because he annoyed the big men. Because he told the truth too loudly. Because he refused to remember where he came from. None of these answers were complete. All of them were true. The rivalry with Karanja, once a personal duel within the tight ring of power, had grown into a symbol for something larger. The conflict between two visions of independence. In one, freedom was a ladder that a few climbed and then pulled up behind them, building walls around their new homes, patrolling their new farms, guarding their bank accounts. In the other, freedom was a door that stayed open, however crowded and chaotic the room beyond it became. JM had spent his final years trying to keep that door from swinging shut. He failed, in the most brutal way a man can fail. He was silenced. His body was left in the forest like an inconvenient secret. And yet, in another sense, he succeeded in a way that outlived him. Every time a new scandal broke and Kenyans asked themselves, how did we get here? His story rose like a warning from the past. Every time a politician took the stage in a village and promised that this time the poor would not be forgotten, someone at the back, muttered, "That's what JM said, and look what they did to him." For those in power, his death remained both a crime and a cautionary tale, a reminder of how far the state could go, and of the blowback that could follow. For those outside power, his life became a yardstick, unfair in its own way. No living leader could match the purity of a martyr, myth, but desperately needed in a country where so many heroes' names had been carefully buried. In modern Nairobi, long after the herdsmen of Ngong Hills had grown old, a new generation wakes up every morning to a city both shockingly changed and hauntingly familiar. Skyscrapers of glass and steel catch the sunrise where once stood low colonial buildings. Mobile phones buzz in matatus painted with hip-hop stars and footballers. On some mornings, the traffic jam to the new shopping malls stretches for miles. And yet, in the shadows of those malls, children with dusty feet still sell small packets of roasted peanuts. In the slums, young men still sit on upturned crates, discussing politics because there is no work to go to. In rural areas, women still walk long distances for medicine, for water, for hope. On a cracked wall near a bus stop, someone has spray-painted a sentence in bold, uneven letters. Kenya must not be a country of 10 billionaires and 10 million beggars. The numbers have changed. The anger has not. People lean against that wall, waiting for their ride, barely glancing at the words. Others pause, read, smile sadly. JM, an old man says to no one in particular, tracing the letters with his eyes. He said it first. Time has done what it always does, blurred some edges, softened some hurts, turned a living, complicated man into a simpler story. But beneath the layers of myth and memory, the core remains. A boy who once watched a train full of food roll past hungry children. A young man who learned in the brutal classroom of a detention camp that silence was another kind of collaboration. A politician who understood that the true deadline was not the next election, but the distance between his people's suffering and his own comfort. He ran against that deadline until the day a car door closed on him for the last time. In the quiet that followed the gunshots in Ngong, the men who ordered and carried out his murder must have believed they had ended something. They had, in fact, started something else, a long, unfinished argument between Kenya and its own conscience, in which the voice of Josiah Mwangi Kariuki still speaks, not from Parliament, not from a ministerial office, but from the mouths of those who refuse, decades later, to stop asking the question he spent his life pressing against the powerful: who is independence for, if not for all of us?